Hey, welcome everyone to our fifth training session in our series in support of our military and veteran populations. I am Jenny DeOlympia, the director of our military and veteran psychology and train vets to treat vets programs here at William James College. I'm also a veteran of the United States Air Force and the spouse of a service member. Thank you so much for joining us today. Your participation and support of our event is a key factor in bringing attention to the needs of our population. Now I'd like to introduce your facilitator, Jose De Ramon. He is a third-year student at William James College's Clinical Psychology Doctoral Program, where he's been actively involved in our Train Vets to Treat Vets program for the past 3 years. Jose is also in the United States Navy Reserves, and he spent 6 years in the active duty Navy as well, during which time he served 2 deployments. He has 10 years cumulative military service. He also has a master's degree in psychology and is specializing in treating military and veteran populations. Jose?
Thank you so much, Dr. De Olympia. So hello, everybody. Today our topic is about leadership, and Corey New is going to be talking today about something called VUCA leadership. So it was originally developed and coined in the early 1990s at the U.S. Army War College in Carlisle Barracks. The acronym VUCA stands for volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. It described the future battlefields on which soldiers would fight in a post-Cold War environment. During the pandemic, this acronym became mainstream to describe the challenges leaders at all levels in the private, public, and nonprofit sectors would face. Our adjustment to a new normal has been hard for many, but some of our burdens have been lessened by knowledgeable leadership. And being able to lead and adapt to these volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous situations will help us as clinicians, professors, leaders, and as a community to meet and overcome the challenges being faced today and in the future. Our presenter today, Corey New, is Chief Operating Officer for ISI Professional Services, leading operations, contracts, finance, HR, recruiting, training, and leadership development. He's responsible for driving results, spurring growth, and increasing the overall efficiency of the corporation. Corey is a retired colonel from the U.S. Army whose last position was brigade commander for the Department of Defense's largest storage and distribution center of over 2,000 employees, 10 million square feet of warehouse space, and $14 billion in inventory. During his military career, Corey has supported disaster relief and combat operations in Haiti, Bosnia, Hungary, Iraq, Afghanistan, and Kuwait. He is a graduate of the United States Military Academy. He has received a dual master's degree in business administration and global supply chain management through Indiana University of Bloomington, and he also has a master's degree in national security and strategic studies from the U.S. Naval War College. Corey recently graduated from the Graduate Certification in Executive Coaching at William James College, and I would like to welcome Corey to speak today to us.
All right. Well, thanks, Jose. It's never good to hear all those things. All that does is tell me that I'm getting older. But thanks, Jenny, and thanks, Jose, for the opportunity to talk about one of my favorite topics, which is leadership. What we'll do today is we're going to try to have a little bit of fun. Let me share my screen, and part of that fun. Okay. Can I get Jose? Can you see my screen?
Yes, unfortunately, yeah, we see your screen just fine.
Okay. Do you see it? All
yes.
Right. All right. I'm not going to go into presenter view because it kind of screws up everything. So if you bear with me, hopefully you'll be able to see the slides as we go through this. When it comes to effective leadership, I think, what we've experienced, over the last 20 years through many different crises, it does bring out the necessity for leaders to sort of step things up. And so for me, I don't know if there's a difference between just leadership and crisis leadership. But what I wanted to talk about today is is maybe at the end of this to have everyone walk away with maybe a little bit better understanding of things that they can do as leaders in addressing, how we perform within the leadership construct. This picture here is one of my favorite pictures I'll share. It's 10th Mountain Division, which is one of the divisions that I served with during my time in the Army, and it's in Afghanistan. So it's, climbing in the snowy regions of the mountains of Afghanistan. And it's just sort of a good picture for me as far as, what crisis leadership is all about. You've got the weather, you've got the amount of stuff that they're carrying around, and it's a difficult situation. And that sergeant who's out in front is the one who's sort of leading the charge. All right, let's see. Next slide. All right. So I think just to sort of show, all of the things that, are sort of recent, from obviously the pandemic to situations when it comes to the weather. You've got active shooters. You've got sort of what we experienced in early January. And I also thought that it was important to bring in this term that's been sort of thrown out there with the Great Resignation. We're seeing, unprecedented changes where people are, as a result of a lot of the different crises, I think, are reevaluating their priorities. And the impact is within companies. There's a different approach that has to be done from a leadership perspective, because if leadership isn't performing during a crisis, I think there's a direct correlation between that and whether an employee wants to stay with that organization. So it's a change in mindset. No longer is it, bonuses and those type of things. It's more about, do I like my job? Do I like my boss? Do I like the team that I work with? And do I like the culture that the organization that I belong to? That's what's becoming more important as a result of a lot of the different crises that we're experiencing. So from an agenda perspective, we'll talk about, sort of what is leadership. Obviously there's lots of definitions out there, but I think it's worth looking at some definitions and seeing some commonality within those. I think we all know what a crisis is, but it just sort of a grounding of that, and why a crisis is different than what, whatever the word normal is. What are the differences? Jose presented the VUCA, so we're going to talk about that and what does that mean. Today it's a term that's being used a lot. It was used more of in a military context, but it's being used within the private sector as sort of a rallying point on what leaders need to be able to handle. And I think what's important too is what can we learn from our military and from our veterans. Not to say that the military has it all figured out, but there are some things that we have to do because of our mission that I think can be helpful and carry over to, nonprofit, public, private sector leadership responsibilities. I'll share an article, John Hopkins study that I did, or not that I did, but that I think I read, that was, I think, a very good article that addressed some of the key things that that will help leaders be successful during a crisis. I'll give you kind of my thoughts on, what you can do as a leader. Oftentimes we talk a lot about things and we read a lot of things, but we really don't break it down into what can you actually do as a leader. So that's something that hopefully I can give you some of the other things that I think in my time that I've learned as being a leader, and especially during crisis situations. And at the end, I've got a video that I would like to share to just sort of summarize for me what an example of crisis leadership is about. All right, so I'm going to stop sharing here, and then I'm going to try to have a little bit of fun. Hopefully this works the way I want it to. But what I'd like you to do is, if you've used Menti before, I'm going to ask you a couple questions, and we'll see what we get for responses. So the first one is, if you go to the menti.com and you use the code up there, it'll ask you to answer this question. As a leader, have you experienced chaos and crisis in the last year? So if you go there and you type in that code, it'll ask you that question. And it'd be interested to see how many people have, personally been in some chaotic crisis situation. So we got one. That's great. All right. Well, we're getting a lot of results in. So it looks like everybody is in their own way is experiencing some crisis. All right. Well, I think what I wanted to do through this is just sort of validate, that in today's world, that maybe 3-4 years ago, the numbers would be a little bit lower, but for what we're dealing with now, we're in a different place. So the next thing I'm going to do is we're going to do a word cloud. I enjoy doing this, but what I'd like you to do is, whoops, let me go back, hit this button. So I'd be interested in doing the same thing. You go in and use this code, but when you think of leadership during a crisis, what are some words that you think are important for a leader when they're dealing with a crisis? Yeah, confident, calm, definitely. Patience, for sure. Regulated. Yeah, that's interesting. I like that. Decisiveness. Yeah, we'll talk a little bit about decisiveness as it relates to leadership during a crisis. Well, great. I think we still got some coming in, but looks like, calm and support, the larger the letters, the more of those responses. So, I think definitely all of those are things that we're going to get into within the discussion. So thank you for that. Let me get back over to our slides. All right. So now I want to talk a little bit about, what is leadership? I think there's an infinite amount of definitions out there around what leadership is. I'm not saying that one is better than the other. I think that the leadership definition, it can be unique and it could be applicable to different things. But some leadership definitions that I've pulled out that I wanted to kind of go through because I think there's some commonality within them. I'm not going to read through them. You can read through them, but the first two, the conversation or the discussion of art. Many people say leadership is is it a science or is it an art? And for what it's worth, my 2 cents, it's both. But I think it's the art part of leadership where people struggle a little bit because it requires sort of thinking. It requires judgment. It requires perception. It requires taking risks. It's not a 2 + 2 = 4 type of formula. And that's, I think, the part where in a crisis, the art part of it is what sort of is amplified when it comes to the actions that a leader takes. When you look at the quote from Warren Bennis, defining a vision, leadership of the capacity to translate vision into reality. I tell a lot of the leaders that I have led and mentored over the years that, good leaders know where they are and they know where they want to go. The great leaders know where they are, know where they want to go, but know how to get there. And the get there part is the hard part when it comes to leadership, whether it's during a crisis or not during a crisis. When you look at the fourth bullet, it's a process. It's a collective effort. It's achieving a purpose. As a leader, the proverbial taking the hill, you as a leader, you can take that hill, but if you don't have anybody following you, it's going to be a lonely place at the top. And so, a leader is defined by the people that follow them. And it's an important part of it because, how do you do that? That's a hard thing to do, is to get everyone to buy into something that's bigger than they are, especially during a crisis. The last bullet, I think, is of the five, I think resonates the most with me because it talks about a capacity, right? So everybody has their own capacity. That capacity could be based off experience. It could be based off education. It could be based off a lot of different things, but the capacity of an individual to perceive, right? So there's the thinking, the art component of leadership, which is the perception, being able to sort of close your eyes, and visualize what you want, what you see, what you know, and what your end state needs to be. Quickly, you're describing and you're constructing a mission and a vision around that. And then you're making critical decisions. And those decisions, as we'll talk a little bit in future slides, there's a time component to that from my experience, some leaders get it right and some wait too long. And so there's sort of that art of when do I make the decision and how do I know when I'm making the right decision? And then lastly, obviously influencing. So, great leaders in a time of crisis have the ability to quickly influence the direction that they want to go. And that's not easy. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the things that make that difficult. So what is a crisis? I think the first slide that I showed some of the different examples, recent examples, but it's a change, right? So change is something that's probably one of the more predominant things that we've been dealing with in all aspects of our personal and professional life. It's sudden, it's evolving. There's an urgent problem and it must be addressed immediately. So I think if you want to understand what sort of categorically defines a crisis, there's definitely a lot of things in this that sort of resonated with me as far as, how do we know that we're in a crisis? And there's different extremes in that they're not all sort of finite, but it could be, something from somebody that is dealing with a family issue that's one of your employees to the far extreme where you have an active shooter within the building that you're working. So there's different ranges within that. So as Jose talked about, this term VUCA, and what I wanted to do is not so much focus on the term. What I wanted to do is sort of synthesize this into what does this really mean for a leader? We use the word VUCA and we understand what it is, but what does that mean? What does that mean for me as a leader as I think through how am I going to adapt and deal with these four different terms? The first one I think is critical thinking. We talk a lot about thinking, but what are we not prepared for and what should we be doing about it? I would tell you that for the 27 years I was in the military, this is the stuff that I would think about a lot. Right? What am I not doing as a leader? What am I not prepared for? And what should we be doing about it? It's just, that's the constant thought that I had going through my brain, because, in the line of work that I was in, it was the difference between, somebody making it home from a deployment, or, those worst case scenarios. And so as a leader, the burden of that is a huge burden. But as a leader, you're sort of thinking about, you can't predict the complexity, the volatility, the ambiguity, and the uncertainty, but you have to think about that, right? You have to think about what could happen. And if you're not, then you're not going to be prepared. The trust and credibility that as a leader you have are paramount during a crisis. And I'll talk a little bit about how do you do that in a couple of slides, but that is not something that you just get during the crisis. There's a sort of a level of equity that you have to build as a leader, and you do that before the crisis, so that in the times of the crisis, people are going to have the trust and confidence, and you've got the credibility because of what you've done, that during that crisis that, people are they're going to follow you. It's very important that you empower your subordinates. And the time to do that is not during a crisis. You've got to build your team and your subordinate leaders in times where you're creating crisis as a leader, but you're empowering them. You're giving them the flexibility, the autonomy to make decisions, to make mistakes, to learn and to grow, but do it in a way that's in a controlled environment. But your long-term vision is that you're focusing them on, when that crisis hits, that they're going to be able to perform, and they're going to be able to do it independently. They're not going to wait for you to have to tell them what to do in order for them to respond. When it comes to processes and policies, there's an infinite amount of policies and processes that doesn't really matter what organization you're in. But if they're not practiced and they're not trained to, and they're not communicated or enforced, they're just words on a slide or on a piece of paper. And the challenge is we for example, you can have a active shooter policy, but if you haven't thought through it, rehearsed it, defined roles and responsibilities, communicated it, and practiced it, when the time comes, if that unfortunate situation happens, it's not going to go well. And so that's an example in my mind of how do you have processes and policies in place, but how do you make sure that they're going to be successful? This formula, the performance and potential interference, it's comes from some of the coaching books that I've read, but I really liked it because, the interference to me is sort of the VUCA, right? So every situation, there's a direct relationship between the performance and the potential or the capacity of the leader, and then what's that interference that's in front of them. So if you can reduce that interference, in theory, you're going to increase your performance. I just think it's an interesting way of looking at things from a coaching perspective. We're trying to work with our clients and try to minimize that interference. What's the interference that's reducing their potential and having an impact on their performance? I can't claim credit to this fail. I actually heard it in a podcast the other day, but I thought it was great for this, which, fail is really just a first attempt in learning. And, as a leader, those leaders who create a culture and environment where making a mistake is, has repercussions that don't allow for growth, will create a problem. And so as a leader, you've got to, in those scenarios where you're trying to empower your leaders, you've got to give them the autonomy to make mistakes, but learn from them. And the learning part of it is the valuable part, but that sometimes comes with, making poor decisions and making mistakes. And then the last thing, the paralysis by analysis, that's a term that's used a lot. But what happens is, and I've seen leaders within a crisis, there's so much information that they're trying to get because they want to make the best decision, but it paralyzes them. It makes them wait longer or too long for them to make a decision because they're not confident in just when do I make the decision based off of the amount of information that I need. All right, so a little bit about this Johns Hopkins University study, and I have to thank Dr. DeOlympia for sharing it with me. She definitely it was a great article, but some of the things in here that I think are very important. I'm not going to go through them all. Structure. In the military, one of the things that the rigidity that comes with being in the military is structure, whether it's your organization, your chain of command, but everybody kind of knows what they're supposed to do. Now, that doesn't happen overnight. It takes time, but redundancy, a routine, those type of things build confidence when there are times of chaos, because it's a repetitive process that everybody knows what they're supposed to do. And that structure will minimize the amount of an impact to the leader. So when it comes to listening before you speak, there are the burden of being a leader in times of crisis is that everybody's watching everything that you say, everything that you write, anything that's an action that requires you to communicate something. Sometimes the best thing to do in those situations is just to listen. And instead of the natural tendency sometimes for leaders is they think that because they're in charge, they're the ones that have to do all the talking. They're the ones that have to make the decisions. And sometimes the best approach as a leader is to know what are the best questions to ask. What are you trying to accomplish? Because that will help you in your decision-making process. So communication, very, very important when it comes to the crisis. Transparency, the timeliness, and the truthfulness. There are times where a leader will be reluctant to share information because of a response. And I would tell you that there are ways that you can communicate, what you know. And if you don't know, communicate that. It helps with some of the anxieties that people are dealing with whatever the crisis is. But as a leader, you have to understand that balance between, communicating and not communicating, but doing it in a way that, your credibility is defined, or part of your credibility is defined through that communication. Because if you get it wrong, it's going to have a negative impact on your ability to communicate. The cohesive groups, do better with stress and challenges than non-cohesive groups. I think this is a very important part of going back to that, the year of resignation. When you look at teams and you look at companies, the ones that are cohesive are the ones that are going to be successful during a time of crisis. We talk about the word culture, and we talk about morale, and I talk a lot about like what people use the word culture, and I ask, my question I usually ask is what is a culture? What does that really mean? Is culture about having pizza parties on Friday and everybody comes in and has fun? Or is culture really about accountability and a set of norms that people are holding themselves accountable to? Those are the things that create cohesiveness within a group. The pizza party on a Friday is a transactional way of, it's good, it's fun for a couple hours, but if the culture doesn't exist, you're not going to get that cohesiveness. So what can we learn from our military? A couple of things that I think, again, not saying that the military has this all figured out. But we do deal in a world of crisis, and it's something that leaders have to deal with every day. Flexible organizations, we talked about cohesive organizations, but flexible organizations, and you create flexibility as a leader by empowering those around you, right? So you've got to have people who can adapt and be flexible and do it quickly, and they don't require a lot of guidance and direction. So that's sort of a mindset and a culture. A good example for me was when I was in Iraq. We were told that we were not going to get security for our convoys to deliver supplies and logistics when we would get on the road and have to travel hours to deliver different logistical supplies. So we had to pivot. We had to be flexible, and so we ended up taking mechanics and medics and people who ran warehouses, and we had to train them to do the same thing that the infantry, as an example, was trained on how to do, because we had to provide our own convoy security. And it was amazing to me how cohesive we were in doing that. And it brought together people who didn't necessarily, that wasn't what they were trained to do, but they had the mindset that they had to be flexible and support the mission. When you look at centralized management and decentralized execution, there's a time where you want the management of priorities, resources, risk to sort of be centrally managed, but you want to decentralize that execution. You want to empower your leaders during normal times to build confidence during chaos. And I've already kind of talked about that. Resilient leaders tend to be generalists, not specialists. And what that really means is, when I look to hire somebody, what I'm looking for is, do you have the ability to solve problems? Can you critically think? When you run into, a problem, how do you overcome that? Those are the things that I'm looking for, which tend to be more of a generalist approach to leaderships. I'm not going to say that you can train somebody on everything, but when it comes to success within an organization, I would tend to want to surround myself with the generalists who have those skills versus somebody that has more of a functional experience, but doesn't have those skills to be resilient. Talked a little bit about conversation. It's a very important tool. I forgot the L, I apologize, but it's an all-powerful tool. In the experiential group that I do on Thursday nights, we've talked about conversation and how do you do that? How do you as a leader walk around and talk to your organization and use it as a way to build trust? It's an art. It's not something that you just walk around and have conversations. There's a strategic approach that you have to take when it comes to building the trust. Over communicate, but manage expectations. Going back to what we talked about with the communication part in the previous slide, I have some scar tissue where I was attempting to do the right thing by communicating, but I wasn't thinking about managing those expectations, and the point that hope is a dangerous virtue. So if you communicate something because you're concerned and you want them to know something that's going to put them in the mindset that they're excited about something. So as an example, at the end of a deployment, everybody kind of wants to know, when are we going home, right? And so there's this balance of how do you communicate that in a way that manages expectations and doesn't give a false sense of hope. Because guess what? As soon as you say we're going home on this date, the first thing that those people are going to do is call back to their families, and they're going to tell them that. And that's a dangerous thing, because that creates anxiety. And then when things change, it becomes frustrating. So, good example of how do you learn to manage those expectations within a sort of an environment that where hope is that dangerous virtue that you've got to take into consideration. Preparation and practice, they're key. And it's not something that I think outside of the military that people think about, but there's things like we're dealing with because of the pandemic. So, working from home is a much different environment from a leadership perspective on how do you do that, right? So everybody was thrust into this, potentially working from home scenario, and you had to change and adapt. You had to lead in a different way. It required a different skill set as an organization in order for you to be successful. So, is that something that you would want to prepare for and practice? If you anticipate that this is something that you may have to do, you may say, hey, for 1 week a month, we're going to all work from home. That's easy for us to say now because of what we've been through, but that's kind of an example of how do you prepare for the unexpected. And then lastly, the best decisions from my perspective are made by understanding and balancing time, information, speed, and risk. And the time component, so when there's a crisis going on and you're thrust into the middle of that and you're the leader, you're always thinking about, when do I need to make that decision? How much time do I have to make that decision? How much information do I need in order for me to make that decision? And, sometimes you can make that decision too early, or sometimes you can make it too late. And that's there's an art of that, but there is a direct correlation to the information that's available, the speed with which you're getting that, and the risk of not making a decision or not making a decision at the right time. And it's a delicate balance. And it's, I wish it was as simple as, the 2 + 2 = 4 more science approach, but it's not. And that's the difficult part of leadership when it comes to a crisis, is how do you make those decisions and do it in a way that takes all of this information that's coming at you rapidly, synthesizing it, and then turning that into some sort of vision and direction for where you think you need to go. So some thoughts that I would share, and I'm not the sort of the expert when it comes to this. Is more from just my experiences as a leader, and who has been very fortunate to be put in a lot of crises, but also had some great leaders who coached and mentored me to be successful. So if you're asking yourself, right now, if I was put in charge of a crisis, what can I do to prepare as a leader? So some things are probably going to be a little bit more simple, and some of them may be a little bit more complex. But, obviously look for leadership positions, right? Crises are all around. And when you look for leadership opportunities, it's going to give you the environment and the laboratory for you to learn how to lead in those times of crisis. Something that I think is important when it comes to veterans is look for veterans for mentorship. We in the experiential groups, we talk a lot about, how do you talk to a veteran? What do you do? But I would argue that's a pool of leaders who know how to handle crisis. And so, maybe an opportunity there from a veteran's perspective to pick their brains, ask them questions. How do they do? What do they do to handle those moments of crisis? I think it's an opportunity. The word think. Oftentimes as a leader, we don't just take time to shut the door and think. about where we are, where we want to go, and how we're going to get there. And as a leader, it's a very important. I tell my leaders that, if you're not taking time out on a daily basis to sort of think through things in a quiet, no notification type of environment, you're going to get so wrapped around the axle that you're going to get yourself into the sort of spin X, and you got to pull yourself out of it. And how you do that, from my perspective, is you just sort of think. And it sounds pretty simple, but it's not as easy as you think. So self-awareness is something that I think I learned a lot about through the coaching course. Know who you are, know your strengths, know your blind spots, manage to them. If you're somebody that, is reluctant to make decisions or to do something that, is maybe more of your blind spot, ask yourself, how do I mitigate that? What can I do to prepare? So if you've got to get in front of a bunch of people and you've got to talk, and you're not one of those people that can just get up there and wing it, it requires you to do more preparation up front. So understand who you are, be self-aware, and manage to that. Making mistakes, very important. And that doesn't sound right, but I think you understand why mistakes are important. Also, as a leader, underwrite your leaders' mistakes. I used to say to my leadership that, I take responsibility for everything that goes wrong in the organization, and I will pass on all of the positive things to the leadership. And what I was trying to do was give the culture or an environment where it's okay, right? I'm going to underwrite your mistake, right? Because it's a growth opportunity. When it comes to credibility and trust, it's earned and it's lost every day. And everything that the largest burden as a leader, from my perspective, is knowing that everybody's watching what you do every day. And, you leave every day with a certain level of trust and credibility as a leader, and you show up the next day with that same level of trust and credibility, and it's either going to go up, it's going to go down, or it's going to stay the same. And, you've got to build that equity. That's, as a leader, if you're not building your leadership or your credibility and trust equity, when the crisis hits, it's going to be difficult for you to perform in the way that you would want to. But humility is, from my perspective, one of the most important leadership traits, whether it's during a crisis or not. The power of saying, I made a mistake, or I made a poor decision, or I did something wrong, is not intuitive for leaders to do that, because, you don't want to show that there's a crack in the armor, if you will. But if done correctly, it's very powerful. And it really does, from a credibility, trust perspective, bring a human element to leadership that sometimes is hard for people to understand, that it's okay for you to do those things. As a leader, I like to look at every situation an issue as a leadership opportunity for me or for another leader. And, I try to use those opportunities to sort of do that growth, empowerment. But as a leader, think of situations, instead of just reacting to the situation. How can I use this in a way that's going to help me or help somebody else become a better leader? And if you can do that and not be so prescriptive in telling somebody how to do that, give them a direction and a guidance, but allow them the opportunity to sort of figure it out on their own, and sort of mentor them through that process. You'll benefit from it as a leader, and so will they. And then lastly, surround yourself with leaders and people who think differently and have different experiences. Often leaders like to surround themselves with people who think like them, who won't challenge them, who won't bring a different perspective. And I would tell you that my success as a leader is surrounding myself with people who think differently, and who will provide me with, I don't need you to come tell me that you've got a problem. I always say there's no shortage of problems. What I'm looking for is people who can provide solutions and who can think differently. And that's That's an important part of your mentorship with leaders, because in that time of crisis, you don't need people just coming to you saying, I've got a problem, right? You need them saying, hey, I got a problem, but here are some solutions, and here's my recommendation. That's the type of people that you want to surround yourself with. Okay. So we're almost done here. I think we're doing good on time. What I want to do is share this this short video. His name's Florent Groberg. He is a recent Medal of Honor winner, and it's just a little bit of a story about what he experienced as a leader in Afghanistan. All right, here we go.
Kunar Province, eastern Afghanistan near the Pakistani border, August 8th, 2012. 5 soldiers from the U.S. Army's Task Force Mountain Warrior stepped out from their forward operating base. The mission was routine: provide a security escort for 7 senior U.S. and Afghan Army officers en route to a weekly security meeting at the provincial governor's compound nearby. Leading the security team was a 29-year-old U.S. Army captain, Florent Ahmed Groberg, nicknamed Flo, serving his 2nd tour in Afghanistan. Born outside of Paris, he was raised by his French-Algerian mother and adopted American stepfather. When Flo was in middle school, the family moved to the United States. Shortly before graduating high school in 2001, Flo became a naturalized United States citizen. Like so many who came before him, Florent Groberg wanted to give something back to the adopted home that had given him so much. And so after graduating college, he became an officer in the United States Army. Flo proved a natural soldier and leader, and by the mission of August 8th, 2012, the men of his team had grown to trust each other completely. Intelligence reports suggested heightened threats, and so the team proceeded with caution toward the compound. As they approached the small bridge, 2 motorcycles came speeding toward the patrol, which was supplemented by about a dozen Afghan soldiers. It was an ambush. At that moment, a lone man crept from a nearby building, slowly backing toward the patrol. The Afghan soldiers rushed to flag down the motorcycles, which soon turned and sped away, a diversion. Captain Groberg noticed the man approaching the patrol as the Afghan soldiers were distracted. He yelled at him to stop. The man turned, staring at the patrol with blank eyes, most likely drugged to numb his fear, then started straight at Flo and the officers he was guarding. Without hesitation, Captain Groberg rushed at the man, blocking him across the chest with his rifle. He felt a bulky vest under the man's clothes, a suicide bomb. Instinctively, Groberg grabbed the vest, throwing the man away from the patrol. His comrade, Sergeant Andrew Mahoney, rushed to his aid as they drove the man into the ground. With a flash, the suicide bomber detonated his vest. The blast sending thousands of ball bearings in every direction and knocking Groberg some 15 feet away and wounding Mahoney. The blast startled a second suicide bomber who had been hiding inside a nearby building, who detonated his bomb before he could attack the patrol. Coming to seconds later, his leg shattered and covered in his own blood and the blood of his attacker, Captain Groberg grabbed his pistol and began dragging himself out of the kill zone. Though bleeding out and expecting a follow-up attack, he was determined to remain at his post. Suddenly, his platoon sergeant appeared, grabbing the wounded captain by his body armor and dragging him to a nearby ditch. A tourniquet was applied to his leg, saving his life. As he was carried toward an armored truck to be evacuated from the field, he continued to direct his men. As he was loaded into the truck, a senior NCO looked him in the eyes and said, "Sir, I've got this. You're done." The door closed, the pain set in, and all went black as Captain Groberg was rushed to the first of what would be nearly 3 dozen surgeries to save his leg. The men who served with Captain Florent Groberg knew they had witnessed extraordinary heroism that day. And yet, as with so many heroes, Captain Groberg's valor came on what he'd remember as the worst day of his life, as 4 of his brothers in arms were killed in the blast. Among them were Command Sergeant Major Kevin Griffin, Major David Gray, Major Tom Kennedy, and Ray Guy Abdel Fattah. It was their story, their sacrifice that Captain Groberg asked his countrymen to remember when on November 12, 2015, President Obama awarded him the United States military's highest award for valor, the Medal of Honor. The medal recognized the valor and sacrifice of a soldier, an American by choice, who in seeking to give back to a home that had given him so much, in turn, became one of its greatest heroes.
All right. Well, hopefully you enjoyed that. I think some of the things that kind of came out of this was the sort of the cohesiveness that they talked about with the team. His sergeant coming up and saying, "I got this," right? You want, one of the things that I always say about being a leader is if you can't leave with your team and know that they can continue to do the mission, then you're not doing what you need to do as a leader. So I think there's a lot in that. I mean, there's the speed with which all of those things was happening is, that's a good example in my mind of how quickly and how rapidly things can go wrong. And when that happens, what are all the people that are doing and the actions that they're taking independently? If they haven't thought about those things and prepared for that moment, arguably, unfortunately, more lives could have been lost. So hopefully you enjoyed that. So that's all I have. I'll turn it over to back to Jose and see if we got about 5 minutes and see if there's any questions.
Thank you so much for your presentation today, Corey. Just so everybody knows, our next presentation will be on January 21st. It'll be about co-parenting and deployment trauma with integrative strategies in couple and family therapy by Professor David Haddad. We invite you all to come to it, please. We thank everybody for being here today. Jenny, is there anything else?
Yes, I just wanted to again thank everyone for coming out and supporting our community in this way. We're really honored to have each of you here because it does show great support in our community for our military and veteran populations. And also to thank Corey New for your awesome presentation on the importance of different leadership role, the importance of leadership in crisis. Because I know you're well experienced in that, and we really appreciate your expertise. So thanks very much. And Jose, thanks for all of your work in putting this together, and also to everyone else who was helpful, Dr. Taveridic and Emily. Thank you very much, everyone. Hopefully we see you next time.
Have a happy holiday.
Thank you very much, Corey and Jose. It's very appreciative. I wish we could drag you into the public schools and help you with the threats every day. So if you got some free time, let us know.
I always have free time, so anytime.
I'm
right,
always
Jenny?
happy to participate.
Yes, absolutely.
Whatever I can do to help. So anytime, Pamela.
Thank you.